In today's episode, we're learning how to make gluten-free bread. I'm gonna be totally honest with you. This is the best gluten-free bread I've ever tasted. Erin came into the kitchen. She showed me different ingredients that are utilized in making this bread. We incorporate some black olives into it. So let's see how it's all done. Welcome to the Food 52 video studio. My name is Josh. I'm here with Erin.
Hi Josh, how are you? We're gonna make some bread.
With a lovely cookbook. This is Catalan, the language?
No, so this is French.
Okay.
Canela vanille.
Okay.
I'm from the Basque Country in northern Spain.
Yeah.
But I worked for a lot of French chefs, and I
Okay.
loved French and how they said canela vanille.
Yeah.
So then it ended up being
And
like
those
that.
are like the smells that you think of when you think of like a nostalgic sort of kitchen?
Yeah, cinnamon and vanilla.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're here today to talk about gluten-free bread, gluten-free baking. Is that a specialty of yours, would you say, or are you sort of doing all different cooking projects?
I used to be a pastry chef.
Okay.
And was diagnosed with gluten intolerance about 10 years ago. So I've been gluten-free since then.
Yeah.
And it's been my goal to really kind of conquer gluten-free bread, like good gluten-free bread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of home cooks out there who are looking for reliable, delicious gluten-free bread. So I'm happy to provide them with some of that today.
Okay, we'll make it.
All right, so let's get started.
Okay, great.
First things first, we're gonna work with some yeast to get that activated.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're gonna activate the yeast. We're gonna use active dry yeast.
Right.
And the reason why you have to activate it in hot water is because active dry yeast is the yeast that is surrounded with a little bit of like dead cells. So you have to kind of break through those for it to come to life.
Okay.
And then we're gonna add a little bit of honey. So usually in bread, when you add a little bit of sugar to yeast, it speeds it up because
Okay.
it starts to eat really fast.
Right.
And our water needs to be at about 105, 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
Sure.
So we need to make sure it's not too hot, because if it's too hot, then it will kill the yeast.
Right.
If it's not warm enough, it'll take longer, and it's just, I mean, you can work with a little bit of colder water, but
Yeah.
it's usually 105.
Once I add the honey and I add the water 105, 110 degrees, we'll know that it's working when we see little bubbles starting to
Yes,
form at
it'll
the
be
top.
like, there will be like a foam, sort of like a brown-gray foam on top of the
Yeah.
water.
And for the cooks at home, if you're not seeing that active foam, if you have older yeast, it might mean that your yeast is dead and you need to buy new yeast. That does happen.
Yeah, yeah. And in the US, I think this is the most common yeast product.
Dry active yeast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you weigh your water.
I weigh my water because in baking, I wouldn't say 2 grams will make an impact, but the variance especially I found with liquid measuring cups,
Yeah.
I think bread needs a lot of consistency.
Yeah. Yeah.
For our own sake. And
Yeah.
so I like to weigh everything.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
They say to weigh the dry ingredients for sure, but weighing the liquid also,
Yeah.
why not?
Yeah, especially because there is a lot of liquid.
Yes.
In this recipe. So
Yeah. So we're going for 400 grams
400
here.
grams. People get intimidated by scales, but
Uh-huh.
it's actually I find it so much cleaner to work with a scale, because you're not taking flour from a bag or a jar and then using it like this measuring cup and then putting it in a bowl. It's just, you can do it directly in the bowl where you're ultimately working.
Right.
So I find it actually easier, it's precise.
So you're right. I was
You're a little
off
short.
by about 24 grams here using the cup versus the scales. We're just gonna take the temp one more time and make sure it should be right around 110 degrees. After about 5 minutes, we should see some little bubbles forming on the top of
Exactly.
this bowl here. And that's how we know that our yeast is active and alive. Now, I don't know all the science here.
Okay.
When it comes
Make
to
sure
bread
like all
baking,
your
but-
little granules are give it a good whisk. Yeah.
Okay.
Work it. It's okay if there's a little bit undissolved, but you want, for that activation to happen, you want to make sure like the yeast is broken down.
Sure. And the honey is going to, the yeast is excited to be in the bowl with the honey, right?
Yes, it's food.
Okay.
It's food. Yeah. So you could use sugar if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Honey just adds another depth of
Sure.
flavor in the loaf. Also, it adds a little bit of moisture. You've made this loaf before. You know it's moist.
Yes.
So it's I just like it. I liked having a little
Do you
bit
ever
of a honey bread.
experiment with like maple syrup or agave, other different sweeteners?
Yes, I haven't made this one with maple syrup. I
Yeah.
think you probably could, because there's not that much that it would affect. Sometimes the viscosity of the honey versus maple syrup could affect it, but this is not that much that it would make a difference, I think. So you could definitely use maple syrup.
Should we weigh out the dry ingredients?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this particular recipe uses brown rice flour, sorghum flour, and the tapioca starch, like you said. Do you experiment with a lot of different types of gluten-free flours?
I do. I experimented with them a lot more in my first book, but the feedback sometimes was that there were too many options, and then people got confused I think a lot of people are a little afraid of, if I don't have sorghum flour, can I use oat flour? Switching things up, which usually it's okay. If it's like a whole grain flour, let's say sorghum, brown rice, oat, they're pretty interchangeable.
Okay.
But then for this book, I really wanted to tone it down and just have like an array of 4 or 5 flours that I would mix up.
That's nice. So tapioca starch has a clearly different consistency than the brown rice flour and the sorghum flour. What does this do structurally for the bread?
So the starch, either potato or tapioca, in this case we're using tapioca, it really adds a little bit more lightness and also helps bind. It's a thickener.
Right.
So that's one of the elements that will help the bread kind of congeal as it's baking.
Interesting. We're adding 1 tablespoon of caraway seeds. This seems sort of just like a fun flourish. Like it's not necessary for the bread.
No, and in fact, this recipe could be as plain as you would want it. So if you were just wanting to do like a sandwich bread that doesn't have anything in it, we're gonna add olives later, but you could avoid it, or you could put nuts in it, seeds. So it really is a versatile way, just playing around.
Yeah, of course. That must be part of the fun too. If you
Yeah.
want to use dried fruit or nuts, sort of customize it however you like.
Exactly.
1.5 teaspoons of salt. All right, so our dry ingredients are all set. While we've been working on the dry ingredients, it seems like the yeast is alive. We see those little bubbles on the top there. That's a good sign. We're going to add psyllium husk powder to this yeast mixture.
Yes.
Now, what does that do, the psyllium husk?
What happens when you're fermenting yeast is it releases alcohol and CO2, right? So when you have gluten, which is an elastic protein, these gases are released, and then you have these layers of dough that can trap it.
Right.
But if you don't have that elasticity, because you don't have gluten, then you need to somehow create it. So psyllium comes from the seed of the plantago plant. That's what most people are using now as a binder.
Yeah.
So this creates this sort of like gummy effect without being really gummy in your mouth.
It's interesting to think of gluten-free baking as trying to create elasticity. Where there's no gluten, we're sort of building a similar structure to catch the air and make the bread have structure, sort of thing.
Yeah. And you will never have these holes that you see on breads on Instagram, but it does really work, and it does hold it together, and it allows for expansion without breaking.
After adding the psyllium husks, we're gonna let this sit for another 5 minutes or so, and it should noticeably thicken. While we wait for this to thicken, I'll set this off to the side and we can prepare our loaf pan.
Yeah.
You do a little olive oil and you sprinkle a little bit of the brown rice flour into it?
Yeah, just even if you have a nonstick loaf, I like the feeling of flour being around the loaf, just for looks and like texture.
Yeah.
So
does it get little sort of toasty bits around the outside?
Yeah, and just kind of that variance of color, and I really like it.
A lot of it is visual, I think.
It's visual,
where it looks sort of rustic with the toasted flour on top.
Exactly.
So it's been a few minutes now. You can see this has this oatmeal-y, almost gelatinous kind of a texture.
Perfect.
That means it's ready.
Well, we have to add the apple cider vinegar.
You add it into here?
Yes.
Okay.
And that actually, this is more, I think, in the recipe to balance out a little bit of the sweetness of the honey.
That's nice. Can you taste it in the final bread? Will you be able to taste a little bit of tang, or you think it's subtle?
I think it will be a balancing, more balancing than actually feeling like I'm eating something that has vinegar in it.
Right. we have our dry ingredients. You add the olives at the end?
We can do it now too, actually, to
Right.
make it easier. Sometimes I mix this in the KitchenAid mixer with the dough attachment.
Right.
And because that's a little bit more, there's a little bit more traction maybe in the bowl and the speed, it breaks down the olives too much. But if we're doing it by hand, I think it's okay to add them from the beginning. Yeah, so you could add at this point you would add your nuts or anything, other seeds that you're using.
Right. Any herbs? Do you
any
ever
herbs.
play around with like rosemary, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. Yeah. All right, but let's make sure we scrape all of those little bits because it looks in the bowl that it's not that much, but when you're actually scraping it, it's probably like a tablespoon
Yeah.
or two of moisture and psyllium.
Is there a risk of over mixing
Nah.
the dough because there's no gluten? So like, okay, with traditional bread, if you over mix the dough, you can mess it up because of the gluten. But with this, sort of nothing
There's
will
nothing
happen,
in
right?
it. And in fact, it's good to mix it really well because that helps with hydrolyzing, meaning the water gets absorbed into the flour better. And then that gives more room for elasticity.
Once it's fully mixed and kneaded, we're gonna let this dough rise for about an hour in the loaf pan.
Yes.
Are there circumstances where you would have it sort of rest overnight in the refrigerator and bake it the following day?
You could if you don't have time or you want to make it fresh in the morning.
Yeah.
Warning: it does take long to bake.
Right.
So I think the whole process is an hour and a half.
How's this look?
That looks great. I would actually
Knead it a little
need it
more.
a little bit more just because
There's still a little
psyllium
dry flecks.
that there's a little bit of like clumpy psyllium.
Yeah. It does have that bounciness that you were saying from the psyllium husks. It's harder to knead. I find this harder to knead than traditional bread
Okay.
because it doesn't stick to itself in the same way
Yes, it
necessarily.
breaks.
Someone once described gluten to me like slinkies, protein slinkies, where they're able to stretch and come back on themselves. Because there's no gluten in this, you can see it will sort of tear rather than stretch.
Exactly. The way we learned when I went to culinary school, it was gluten was like a parachute.
Huh.
It's sort of like when air rises, it just
It captures it.
captures it
right.
like
So
that.
if you're a bread
Yeah.
baker, it's a parachute. If you're a pasta person, it's a slinky.
Exactly.
More?
Yeah. Let me see. Can I feel it?
Yeah, please.
I kind of have to feel it.
Yeah.
And then I like for the surface, what the top is going to be, I like to I want it to feel smooth.
Yeah.
So, and then this is not, our loaf is long, but if I were to do like a round bowl,
Yeah.
this is kind of the motion I like to do, so it seals on the bottom.
That looks great.
Yeah, but
Much nicer than whatever I was just doing.
because this is longer, we're gonna
Yeah.
give it another shape. Yeah, and it feels, right? Like it feels bouncy.
So you form this beautiful loaf, and now we're gonna let it rise. You say it should come to like just before it reaches the top of the loaf pan.
Exactly. The thing to be careful with this loaf is that if it overproofs, what will happen is the crust will bake in the same spot as is,
Yeah.
but the crumb will rise, and then it will be too active, and then it'll collapse on itself, and then you'll see sort of like a hollowness when you cut it. So I always prefer to underproof it than over. You never want to overproof anything anyway, but to be safe, it's an hour. I would say if your room is like 70 degrees, that's safe. If you're like 90 degrees and 90% humidity, you definitely want to speed it up and maybe do 30 minutes.
Interesting.
So I would say the visual part of until it reaches almost to the top of the pan is good.
Right.
So we're going to cover it.
We let this dough rest for about 35 minutes. And you think it's looking pretty good at this
I
point?
think so because I can see it's to the top. I think if we let it ferment longer, it will overproof.
Yeah.
So let's dust it with a little bit of flour on top, and then it goes in the oven for an hour. And then we actually take it out of the pan and put it back in the oven on the rack.
Yeah.
So it gets a nice exterior crust for about 45 more minutes.
Now, is that typical for gluten-free baking where you start it off in some sort of vessel like a loaf pan, and then after a certain amount of time you take it out and you let it keep cooking?
Yeah, because you want to create, you know, a nice crust.
Right.
And if it's in the pan, sometimes it doesn't, like the moisture kind of tends to stay there. So
Interesting.
once it has a good structure that it won't collapse,
Yeah.
then you can actually just take it out and put it directly.
All right. Here we have our finished bread. We have been patient, even though it looks so good and it smells so good, we didn't cut into it right away because when it's hot right out of the oven, if you try to cut into it, it could affect the texture.
It's just, the moisture is still a little bit there. You want to kind of settle and let the moisture evaporate.
Sure.
As it cools down, you know, it's continuing cooking inside. And then if you cut it, just applying the pressure down with a knife, it will make the crumb sort of like stick to
Sticky.
each other.
Yeah.
And it is a moist crumb, so
Yeah.
it will, even tomorrow, it will feel moist.
Okay.
But it won't collapse the same way. So I like to really give it
Yeah,
good
we give
hour.
this about an hour.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be hot or
Yeah.
really warm.
It still feels slightly warm, but it's not hot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it looks great.
This is really nice.
Yeah. Okay, now we have to taste it.
Yeah.
I'll put some butter on it. You can see a little bit of steam escaping, but
The
it's
crust feels really nice, and the center feels moist.
Can
Yeah.
you taste the honey and the caraway?
The first note I got was the caraway seeds. I thought that was really nice. Gives it that like almost like rye type of flavor. And then the crust has nice, sort of dark toasty flavors. The inside is warm and, you know, bread is supposed to make you
Supple,
feel like comforted, you know? This is like comfort food. It's great. Yeah,
I'm glad.
bouncy and moist on the inside. This is fantastic bread.
Thank
I
you.
think I could feed this to people and they would have no idea if it had gluten or not.
Yeah. Thank you.
This was a lot of fun. I feel like I learned a lot. This was a really good bread experience. Sometimes with bread I feel pretty awkward because it's not something I'm very familiar with. But this turned out fantastic.
Great. I
Yeah.
hope you go home and make it.
Yeah, you know what? This is a recipe. It was simple enough that I would recommend it to people, and I could make this at home. Thanks for coming on. This was a lot of fun. And for the people at home, if you enjoyed this video, click like, click subscribe, and we'll see you next time.